Mighty Gunvolt Burst, released in 2017 for Nintendo Switch and other platforms not relevant to today's subject matter. Okay, so there was a game called Mighty Gunvolt that was a thing, and it was a perfectly fine little game thing for what it was. And then along comes this Mighty Gunvolt Burst thing that people keep bugging me about, which is supposedly a sequel, spin-off, remake, reboot, reimagining, whatever. Call it its own thing, but not really, because the only thing Burst shares with Mighty Gunvolt is the title and some of the characters it uses. This is less of a sequel to that little game, and more of an attempt to remake the somewhat divisive Mighty No. 9. You know, the game that wasn't, well, you know.
Even if it's not perfect, it's better than nothing. At least that's my opinion.
Yeah, that's the one. And that's pretty much the gist of it, really. You get to pick one of two characters, Gunvolt or Beck, each playing somewhat differently from each other, but not by much. Further DLC packs will enable additional playable characters that are drastically different, but I'm sticking with the base 2 for this run. Although yes, I did play the demo so I could unlock the Galgun lady, and the less said the better is all I will say in that regard, but anyways, while there are some slight differences in the somewhat flimsy story being told, Burst is just window dressing for what is essentially an 8-bit-ish demake of sorts of the Mighty No. 9 video game. You're blowing through the same sort of stages as Mighty No. 9, you're fighting the same enemies as Mighty No. 9, as well as the same bosses as Mighty No. 9. Most of the game's soundtrack is taken from Mighty No. 9, and while the game's final stretch does eventually deviate into more Gunvolt territory, this is essentially a remake of sorts of Mighty No. 9 into a more Mega Man-like clone thing without calling it Mighty No. 9, because that game made people cry like anime fans on prom night, or whatever the vernacular is supposed to be. I don't really recall, I don't really care, quite frankly. So Gunvolt Burst remakes Mighty No. 9 into a more traditional 2D side-scrolling platformer, much in the same vein as Mega Man, which, you know, I'd normally be cute about it and go, you know, like that one game there. But that's clearly the intent, and the inspiration here is to make this more of a 2D Mega Man-like game, and for what it's worth, they've done a good job of nailing that feel, which is no surprise, since Inti Creates have a number of Mega Man games under their belt, including Mega Man 9 and 10, so they should know how to produce a good Mega Man-style game when the situation calls for it, and that is clearly on display here. You have a stage select, you run through stages, you have bosses to fight, and you have a boatload of customizable abilities that work a little differently from the usual Mega fare. The setup is fairly familiar. Play an intro level showing you the ropes, then get your obligatory stage select with 8 mighty bosses to contend with, and once those are gone, it's off to the final set of levels. You are running, gunning, and jumping your way through fairly linear levels, blasting enemies, collecting various power-ups until you face the level boss and defeat him to clear the level. You don't get any special weapons for doing so, but you do get parts relating to your extremely customizable abilities that work differently from the usual Mega fare, none of which involve Burst. Let's get that out of the way. The titular Burst refers to a bonus you attain whenever you kill an enemy at point-blank range, and you string up burst kills to build up your combo. Any kill from a distance breaks the chain, and so if you want to score big, you'll have to keep that combo going. But that's about all it's good for. Bursting allegedly improves your other abilities the longer you keep your combo going, but it doesn't mean much to matter enough. And ultimately, they're just there for bragging rights and high rankings, so if you don't care for such things, you could easily ignore this and play the game much like that one game there. There are no lives in Mighty Gunvolt, you can die as often as you like and it doesn't matter. The game does keep track of how many times you've died and you're penalized in the final score tally, but again, if you don't care about high scores or anything like that, this bears little to no consequence overall. Now, one aspect of Burst that does have some benefit to your overall experience is the customization feature, where you can pick a slot and customize your weapon, choosing the type of projectile, its size, the number of shots you could have on screen, and so on and so forth. Options vary between the two characters. Beck can have more projectile options, while Gunvolt can enable other abilities that make use of his septimal powers. That's a Gunvolt thing if you're not familiar with that franchise, and I really need to give that thing a shot one of these days. And I'd imagine playing the other characters will also include options exclusive to them. At first your options are limited, but as you collect parts, you'll be able to change other things like shot trajectory, elemental properties, and can even enhance your character's other abilities, such as damage reduction and such. Options cost points, really, or CP, and the more added to a slot, the more points it costs to equip. and you could only equip weapons up to your current CP max value. Boosting your max value boils down to attaining crystals dropped by enemies, as well as encountering them while exploring the stage, which basically means shoot walls to find potential hidden rooms housing said bonuses. The game has 24 slots. 23 of them you could customize, and the first slot is always your default shot, which you could play through the entire game with if you want to. There's an infinite achievement you could achieve to achieve that, or something. While I like the idea of giving the player the option of building their own weapons and such, the actual process feels a bit more cumbersome than it needs to be, especially as you start to have more options to change stuff. Some of the options you're given seem entirely superfluous and not all that useful, and getting to use the juicier options basically boils down to boosting your CP max count, and that boils down to lots of grinding. Now with Gunvolt, it's not that big of a deal because he has a lot of neat powers to play with, but Beck has multiple projectile options and they all do the same thing until you add an element to it. And again, I like the idea, and I'm sure some folks would appreciate the wide variety of options and such, but I just want to shoot things. And fortunately, Burst allows me to shoot things, so I'm happy in that regard. Anyway, aside from customizable bits and burst combos on top of combos for people who seem to be into that combo on combo action or whatever the case may be, I'm still looking for that dash that makes me breakfast. I still haven't found it yet. Nobody's going to get that. But anyway, Gunvolt Burst, regardless of who you play, plays like your typical 2D side-scrolling action platform thing that's similar to, you know, that one game there. You run around, you shoot things, you collect food things that serve as reserve health items that you could use in a bind or not use them to gain a score bonus boost at the end of a level. Then you fight a ridiculously bullet spongy boss that takes a ridiculous number of hits to die, and then you pick a rare item to choose from as your reward, either a CP max boost, that boss's element for your weapon customization thing, or a collectible sticker for your custom shit. There are no words. Anyway, yeah, you could play it just like that one game there. You could even play through the whole thing without the need for extra weapons, bursting, or even the food items if you end up getting good. But the game is about as straightforward as you could get with its level design. Even the gimmickry is fairly routine, hanging on to things, disappearing platforms and such, some annoying enemy placement resulting in some annoyingly cheap deaths, but otherwise, the levels are probably the least frustrating of the bunch, especially if you're familiar with this style of platformer. If anything, the only real challenge comes from the boss fights, which tend to be overly aggressive, but manageable once you've figured out their patterns. The only thing that really irks me is the long-ass boss meter, so they'll take quite a pounding before eventually dying. I think this was done to emphasize the weapon customization bit more, and eventually equipping certain elements that bosses are weak to in order to bring in some semblance of that rock, paper, scissors mentality, but ultimately it was the food items that became more of a useful asset than the actual weapons, as they let me last longer in a fight. And if you die, again, no problem. You'll just respawn at a checkpoint in the same state you were in when you passed down it initially, and again, no lives. Retry as much as you want, get a penalty for it, but if you don't care about score, what does it matter? Controls are fairly tight and responsive, the characters feel good and move slickly. You could jump down thin platforms and you'll automatically hang on to things if you come across something that you could hang on to. One thing I wasn't used to was jumping off ladders, because that's the opposite of a typical mega reaction where you just drop from the ladder if you press the jump button. But it's something different, following its own beat for a change, and, you know, controls in general work fine. It plays fine, I think. Mighty Gunvolt Burst adopts the pseudo 8-bit NES pixel art style that has become something of a staple for Inti Create's various retro-style platformers. And it's a nice little niche that they carved out for themselves with a lot of games that they put out. The Curse of the Moon games, the Blaster Master Zero series, among others. So it goes without saying that the graphics are pretty damn slick. The sprite work is exceptional. Much more refined than the original Mighty Gunvolt game. The characters are nicely adapted to this format. The level designs are... well, they do a fine job of turning those Mighty No. 9 levels into 8-bit format, and some of them look decent, with a couple sporting some parallax scrolling as well as some neat lighting. It's something, I guess, I suppose, a game that looks fairly decent, even if it's recycling or gutting a mediocre game to use as its base. Speaking of recycling or gutting, Gunvolt Burst soundtrack is basically the chiptune version of the Mighty No. 9 soundtrack, with a few Gunvolt themes tossed in there for good measure. And Inti Creates didn't just reuse the chiptune versions from that game. They took those tracks and added a few more bits and blips and made newer versions of those tracks, and that's... Okay, look, I was never a fan of the Mighty No. 9 soundtrack. I thought the music was generally weak, none of the tracks were particularly memorable, and even the so-called attempts at chiptuning these things, because there's a retro-sounding soundtrack in addition to the original one, those seemed like a half-assed effort. Burst's take on these tracks are at the very least much livelier, there's more of a kick and life to these things than before, and as such, it's a considerable improvement over the original Mighty No. 9 soundtrack. But at the end of the day, underneath all that shine, it's still the Mighty No. 9 soundtrack, and it's still generally weak sauce. Sound effects are alright, I guess. Nice 8-bit sounding blast explosions and things of that nature. Nothing out of the ordinary for this sort of thing. It's fine, I guess. Overall, Mighty Gunvolt Burst is... well...
it's better than nothing. At least that's my opinion.
Well, that might be underselling it a bit, but in all seriousness, this is a well-made game, steeped in that traditional platformer style that most are familiar with. It's got a bunch of options for the player to dive deep into. It's a well-presented package and such. The two base characters are distinct enough to give the game some replay value, without considering the additional characters that can be purchased. And while I think the customization bit is perhaps a bit too superfluous with its options, and the combo bursting thing is kind of worthless, they do regardless add value to the game if players want to really experiment with those things, so I won't fault Burst for that. As a game in and of itself, Mighty Gunvolt Burst is a solid platformer of the Mega Garden variety for those who need another one of those to satisfy that itch. And for those few remaining Mighty No. 9 fans who want more Beck in their lives, well, sadly, this is as close as you're going to get until they make another one, and fuck knows if that's ever going to happen since Mighty No. 9 itself is but a distant memory by this point. Which isn't exactly what I would call a redemption of that franchise that some folks want to believe this to be. I mean, it's been a while since we last had a proper Mega Man game, but there's still Mega Man stuff being put out there in some form or fashion. When was the last time we had a new Mighty No. 9 thing? Yeah, it's pretty much dead at this point. At least until the NF King rises again and he decides to give this mighty thing another shot. Or maybe we will get that Mighty No. 9 animated series that, quite honestly, was the only thing I was really looking forward to as far as that franchise was concerned, but whatever. Yeah, Mighty Gunvolt Burst, a fine game. Another top-notch Inti Creates crafted retro throwback thing and a long line of them. Well worth checking out if you're into this sort of game. And, yeah, I thought it was okay. That's all I got. Good night.